One thing was abundantly clear during Donald Trump's rambling, muddled, nearly 2-hour speech last night. The state of Donald Trump's union is very different than that of most Americans.
What a difference a president makes. A short time ago, we were a dead country. Now we are the hottest country anywhere in the world, the hottest. It's getting bigger and bigger and stronger. Nobody can believe what they're watching.
Well, that's true. Nobody can believe what they're watching. The Washington Post found that 64% of Americans think Donald Trump is out of touch with the concerns of most people in the United States today, with just 34% of Americans approving of Trump's handling of tariffs, 32% approving of his signature thing, inflation. Campaigned on that. And that anger isn't contained to Donald Trump. It's bringing his party down with him as his party faces a wide enthusiasm gap ahead of the midterms this fall. That same poll, Washington Post poll, found that 79% of Democrats said they were certain to vote this fall, compared to just 65% of Republicans. That's a big gap in what are going to be a lot of close races. I want to bring in political analyst and host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller. Also joining us, senior contributing editor Michelle Norris, and Molly is still with me here at the table. The reason we have three of you here is because I hardly wanted to watch that thing. I certainly don't want to talk about it anymore. But we must a little bit because there were some key contextual points about that speech. Michelle, let me start with you. The bubble, the being divorced from the things that Americans are worried about. Donald Trump seems to once in a while try to land that plane, right? He tries to talk about affordability, the things that really affect Americans, and then he just veers off. He mentioned affordability one time last night, and it was to mock it.
And this is an example of where being in a bubble is really quite a problem for him, where he just either, if he has advisors, he's clearly not listening to them, and he's not showing any kind of empathy for people who really are struggling right now. And part of this is a little unusual, is a little bit nuanced, because by standard economic indicators, the economy is actually doing okay.
That's right.
Talk about affordability. It's not just an economic issue. It is a psychological issue. There are a lot of people who feel like they can't live the life that their parents lived, that the middle class or even a working class lifestyle is slightly out of reach for them. And in a moment where there's so much chaos and so much instability, this is real. This is real. And the fact that he mocks that is surprising. And it also shows that when he's surrounded by people who are as wealthy as his circle is, that he just has no understanding of what it's like to live closer to the ground, where you actually have to sit down at the end of the month and budget and make some really difficult decisions about, does Johnny get new shoes or do we pay for the roof that needs to get fixed? That is just a concept that I don't think he can wrap his head around. I don't think he's ever had to think about that. I don't think the idea of affordability for someone who's grown up with a silver spoon is just something that he can even grasp. And as a politician, he's incapable of showing the kind of empathy that you would hope that someone in that position would have.
Yeah, Tim, Michelle's point is really valid, because if you look at the top line numbers of the economy, economic growth, the Dow, which he talked about last night, unemployment numbers, the top line numbers look really good. If you own a home or multiple homes and you have investments in the stock market, or much of your wealth is in the stock market, this is one of the best economies in the history of the world. In the history of the world. The problem is we talk about a K-shaped economy where some people are seeing a downward shift and some people are seeing upward. This is the jaws of an alligator economy. The rich are doing fantastically, and the poor are not making a go of it.
Yeah, it's true. And the upper middle class is doing great. And to Michelle's point, look, plenty of people have been born with a silver spoon and then managed to develop empathy or surround themselves with people who have different experiences or struggling. Donald Trump has made the choice in the second term, in particular, to surround himself with the richest people in the history of the world, basically.
Just to be clear, we're not talking about sort of rich people, Tim. We're talking about many, many billionaires in his cabinet and those around him who are not in his cabinet who are advising him. Billionaires, not multimillionaires.
Yeah, it goes back to kind of the original sin politically of his second term, which was that inauguration where you had like literally like 4 of the 5 richest people in the world sitting in the front row in front of his cabinet, who also had a bunch of billionaires, right? This and he hangs and he only goes to he's not doing the rallies anymore. He's ensconced in the White House, or he goes down to his clubs where he's surrounded by other rich people, and they are doing well. And you know who else is doing well? Scammers, white collar criminals are doing great right now. You know, they gave J.D. Vance the job of fraud czar last night during the State of the Union, which is interesting because there's a lot to work with. Some of his colleagues are and their families are committing crypto fraud right now, so he could probably start with them. But like that is what they've decided to do. Like he wants to get the adoration of rich people. He wants to enrich himself and his family, and he's made a conscious choice in the second term to focus on that. And I think that is reflective in his political problems with, you know, demographics of people who thought that he was going to make the economy better for them, but instead he's making it better for him.
So he had 2 signature things when he ran for office, Molly, the second time. He had immigration and he had the economy. He is so underwater in terms of approval on both of those things. It's wild. In fact, he invoked Zoran Mamdani last night. Yeah. And I would have thought, you know, you said to me when Trump and Zoran Mamdani had that meeting, you said game recognizes game. Right. I would have thought he would have recognized that Zoran Mamdani ran on basically one issue, affordability. Yeah. Donald Trump all he carried on last night about is how people come across the border and kill Americans.
Well, he's a very undisciplined politician, and that, you know, so he started talking about how much he loves Zoran. But I thought what was really interesting was that you have a Supreme Court that has given him a tariff off-ramp.
Yes,
right?
Totally.
He's supposed to be about affordability. You have these tariffs. They're making everything more expensive.
And he could have said, I was trying to make this better for you, but the Supreme Court wouldn't let me.
And you had John Roberts there between him and Kavanaugh, their faces were like meme after meme, you know, just looking pained and exhausted. And here was his chance to just take an off-ramp, and instead he's doubled down on tariffs. And I think it shows he's just such an undisciplined politician that he can't take a win even when it's sort of right there for him.
As you and I talked about, he was given an off-ramp and he just turned around and ran right back onto the highway in the wrong direction. Michelle, very little will stay with me about that speech. It's not a speech for the ages. But the thing that will stay with me is this wildly racist thing he did in the middle of it. This fraud thing wasn't about fraud. It was about Somalis.
Well, much of that speech, you know, including the way that he used people who deserve our sympathy because of awful things that happen to them, often at the hands of people. Much of that speech was about trying to make America afraid of people who don't look like them. And when he talked about Somalis, he didn't talk about Minnesota. So it was an interesting sort of backdoor way to talk about tangentially about what we've seen going on in Minnesota, because Minnesota has such a large Somali population. But it was, if it was about fraud, you know, let's just say that the fraud that has happened in Minnesota is real. It has a very large price tag. It involved a small number of Somalis, but there are somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 Somalians, ethnic Somalians that live in Minnesota. A very small percentage of them have temporary protected status. Most of them are citizens, and if they are not citizens, they have permanent legal status on their way to citizenship. And it was, you know, the fraud in Minnesota that was attached to a small number of Somalians was used as the pretext for Operation Metro Surge, you know, sending thousands of federal immigration agents into the city. Well, if they were really trying to root out fraud, they would have conducted that surge in a very, very different way. So this was another example of him using sort of heightened polarization to serve his agenda. And what he does is he tries to, you know, he ran into Washington on a hot gust of fear and rage, a rage that he used to generate fear among people. And that is almost like a default for him. You know, when he has nothing else to say, what he goes back to is, let me make you afraid of those people who don't look like you, those people who are taking your America, those people who are taking a country and turning it into something that maybe will feel somewhat uncomfortable for you. He's very comfortable in that space. But when we have so many other things going on in America, and when people are looking at his immigration agenda and they don't much like what they see, I just don't see much currency in that for him.
I'm going to ask